He was given a meta-narrative, a story that was big enough into which his life, even the negative experience of his life, could fit. Daniel was a man who was remarkable by any description. He was a believer in God who rose to positions of enormous power and authority, not only in one ancient empire, but in two. He stands unique in secular history, let alone in the history of those who believe in God. He came to rise to the top in the world empires of Babylon and Medo-Persia. Now, you might be someone that doesn't believe in God. So in order to understand this book, you might think you need a Christian worldview. But actually, I think it's important for everyone to hear the story of Daniel. The interaction in this book involves God, Daniel, and culture. Daniel is a story about a man who went against his culture. And this book not only explains why you might want to go against the dominant culture narratives of the day, but also tells you how you might go against its flow, where and how to align and differ from the culture that's all around you. Now, we've probably all observed in the news this conflict of different belief systems. But how do we navigate our own path? Daniel was a man who set God as his true north. That is, he had a compass in his life, and he made sure that the compass bearing was true north all the time. We're going to find, as we explore this biblical book of Daniel, that although Daniel was removed from us by more than 25 centuries in time, he is not removed from us very much in terms of the background culture as we might think. Most of the issues that Daniel and his friends faced in Babylon are very present with us today. It'll be particularly interesting to see how Daniel retained the courage to keep on believing in God in a culture and society that didn't. So, who was Daniel, and why is he someone worth looking at? The first thing to know about Daniel is, when he was still in his teens, probably around the age of 15, he suffered what was probably a real catastrophe in his life, because the vast empire of Babylon invaded his country. Nebuchadnezzar was emperor of the vast empire of Babylon, one of the great empires of the ancient world. And Daniel begins his story in that fateful year around 605 BC. It was the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah and Jerusalem. Jerusalem in those days must have been a sad and sorry spectacle compared with the high culture of Babylon that burst onto the gaze of these four young men when they entered into the city. It was the largest city of the ancient world. It was magnificent, spreading along both sides of the great river Euphrates, surrounded by a broad wall marked by 8 huge defensive gates, the most impressive of which was the Ishtar Gate, of which you can see a reconstruction in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Its main thoroughfare, the processional way, was lined with a series of magnificent architectural constructions, like the Palace of the Emperor, the Temple of Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonians, Esagila, and the famous ziggurat, Etemenanki, the famous Tower of Babylon, the Temple of Heaven and Earth. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world, as were the famous hanging gardens in the city. Nebuchadnezzar's wife was from the country and she didn't like the city, so he constructed these gardens to reproduce the country in the city. They were magnificent, and this high level of culture in Babylon depended on very advanced engineering and technology, by far the most advanced in the ancient world at that time. Their mathematics was so impressive that it has left its mark on practically everyone's wrist today, because we divide the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds. And that comes from the fact that the Babylonians uses 60 as a base of their calculations. There are also 360 degrees in a full circle, another use of 60. The Babylonians were well advanced in astronomy, and it is believed there was an observatory on top of the ziggurat. They made many accurate observations of the stars, even though it must be said that their astronomy fed their astrology, because their leaders were very interested in the influence that the stars, so they believed, had on what happened on the earth. That is true, incidentally, of many contemporary leaders. They will resort to astrology much more often than many of us think. The Babylonians had made huge advances for the day in medicine. They were able to perform elementary surgery, of course, without proper anesthetics, but nonetheless a very advanced culture. Now, the other thing that must have struck Daniel and his friends as they arrived was that by stark contrast to Israel and Judah, the city was polytheistic in the extreme, meaning that the Babylonians worshipped many gods. It's reckoned, indeed, that at the time there were 1,197 different temples in a city of roughly 100,000 people, although at festival time it could swell to over 250,000 inhabitants. These temples were dedicated to around 300 gods that were recognized by the Babylonians. And Georges Roux, in his informative book Ancient Iraq, says that no other city of the ancient world was so dependent on the gods. So it was a thoroughly pluralistic culture. For instance, the gates of the city had names that were associated with the various Babylonian gods, the Ishtar Gate, the Marduk Gate. Every aspect of society was permeated with idolatry. By idolatry, I mean misplaced devotion to an object, person, or idea, although it is fair to say that often the ancient people didn't love their gods. The point is they trusted them, even though they may have feared them. Their devotion, their loyalty, their trust was misplaced from my perspective as a Christian, because they were putting that trust in something that took the place of God, something which wasn't God. And in the case of the Babylonians, their gods were idols, which were usually, when you analyze them, in essence, simply deifications of the fundamental forces of raw nature and of human nature. And it's logical, isn't it, when you think about it? If there is no objective creator God who is independent of the universe he created prior to it and who upholds it, then in the end you will have to give creatorial power to the forces of nature that produce the universe, because you've no alternative. You can't actually avoid the concept of creation because the universe and life are here. So, to sum up, you either give creatorial power to God or you give it to the fundamental particles of the universe operating under natural law. Now, in that sense, you see, there's very little difference between those deities and the things that people, even scientists, trust in. Because apart from the explicit representation of their deities in the form of statues and idols, they ultimately believed in the same ultimate controllers of the universe as many of my scientist friends do. The forces of nature control everything, and they are basically four: the strong and the weak nuclear force, electromagnetism, and gravity. So There are straight lines to be drawn between the background worldview of the Babylonians and the current worldview that dominates a great deal of the Western Academy. So what we've got here is a group of students, Daniel prominent among them, who are about to bear witness to their faith in God the Creator in this kind of cultural context. And it must be immediately obvious to all of us that this is relevant today for those of us, either Christian, non-Christian, or of any worldview, because what we're going to learn about is what was it that motivated Daniel to stand for God in that culture and not to give in and allow the polytheism to infect his own attitude to things. Why would he do that? Why is belief in the God of the Bible, the Creator, so important? Why was it important then? And why is it important now? So I think Daniel is going to help all of us, from whatever perspective, understand who this God is that they believed in, how they maintained their faith in him, and what rationale there was behind that faith for those of us who are exploring the possibility that there just might be something in this story about a creator God. Daniel begins, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Judah and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. In this opening statement, we see that Daniel is not only placing his book in a historical context, he claims that he's giving us God's perspective on history. And what a fascinating perspective it is. You see, Daniel, as a young man, had been caught up in one of those seismic upheavals of history, one of those shifts of power that lead to endless suffering of many people. Through no fault of his own, he'd been ripped from his parental care and placed in a country with a new language, with new laws, with new educational system, and new gods. He had to cope with an entirely new world because of the siege of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. What did it all mean? For a teenager to face this kind of disruption in their own personal history due to global events beyond their control is deeply traumatic. And the circumstances of that kind of thing raise deep and disturbing questions. Think of it. He had been taught that there was only one true God. He'd also been taught that the temple in Jerusalem was unique. It was certainly unique in the ancient world because it had no images of God. And yet, Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged it. But not only that, he went into it and God did absolutely nothing. What was Daniel to believe now? It was unthinkable. And yet, at the beginning of his book, Daniel makes an apparently audacious statement. He doesn't simply say, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem. He says, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. You can imagine what Daniel's fellow students in Babylon might have said. Daniel, come on. Your belief in the one true God of history is sheer fantasy. The only rational explanation of what happened in Jerusalem is that the greater power of Babylon crushed the lesser power of Judah. It's simply another example of the survival of the fittest. The person with the biggest missiles wins. But Daniel didn't think so. He believed that God was behind the event that changed his own life permanently. How could he be so sure? Well, in the later part of the book, in chapter 9, we get his answer. And there he carefully analyzes the reason for the exile of the Jewish nation and its captivity in Babylon. He analyzes it in terms of Israel's moral and spiritual disobedience to God. You see, Daniel believed in a moral universe where men and women are created in the image of God as moral beings. And God had repeatedly told the nation of Israel clearly through the prophets he sent to them again and again that if they compromised with the idolatry around them, they would be punished by going to a nation that thrived on idolatry. The punishment would fit the crime. They did disobey, and exactly what the prophets had predicted happened. So you see, Daniel, who knew the prophets, came to understand that far from the invasion of Nebuchadnezzar being evidence against God, it became powerful evidence for God's authority and power over history as revealed in the scriptures. It fulfilled, to be more precise, the very prophecy of Jeremiah that Daniel actually had in his possession because he quotes from it. That prophecy said that Jerusalem would one day be handed over to the Babylonian army. It's named. And so that is hard evidence for Daniel and indeed for us that what God says in his word is reliable. And so this is the first paradox of the book that we need to think about. Even life's traumas at the level of personal life can sometimes be evidence that God is at work. Perhaps one of you is facing such a twist in your own personal history that you can't help feeling that if God exists, then he's disappeared behind a black cloud. Daniel is a book that will deal with our minds, but it will simultaneously also deal with our hearts, because it's a story of a man, a young man, who through no fault of his own is caught up in events beyond his control. And instead of being crushed by them, the experience so molds his character that he gains the courage to give some of the most powerful witness to God that this world has ever seen. So the first thing in the book is a question of history. The lordship, or as Christians sometimes say, the sovereignty of God over history at two levels: global history and our own personal history. And the important thing for Daniel was to see his personal history in the wider context of global history. That is, to put it another way, he was given a meta-narrative, a story that was big enough into which his life, even the negative experience of his life, could fit, so that he could move on with hope and not be simply crushed by it and abandon his faith in God because of it. A matter of history. Now, the next thing is a matter of values. I want you to see exactly what Nebuchadnezzar did. And it's a little bit odd when we read this account of besieging Jerusalem, because before he even mentions Daniel, it says this: the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands with some of the vessels of the house of God. Now, we might expect to read at that point that Daniel and his friends were taken at that point. No, the primary thing, the thing that Daniel wants us first to realize, is he took these vessels from the temple and put them into the house of his God. Daniel is mentioned next when the king commanded Ashpenaz, one of his officials, to bring some of the nobility of Israel, including Daniel, and have them trained in the university. So that is one of these strange literary arrangements that we should notice. It raises the question, why mention the vessels before you mention the key role players in the whole book, Daniel with his friends? Why mention them at all? The oddness of the order of the description is designed to grab our attention, and now that it has, at least I hope so, let's ask why those vessels might be important. Well, they reappear. They reappear in the middle of the book, in the final episode of the first half of the book, in the famous Feast of Belshazzar, when Belshazzar, the emperor at the time, takes those vessels out of the place where Nebuchadnezzar put them and insists on his nobles drinking out of them at this famous feast, at which his life was ended by the Medo-Persian invasion. And what Belshazzar did with those vessels led to the ending of his empire. So those vessels turn out to be extremely important. This is not some innocent little thing. It's a very big thing. And so those vessels appearing at the beginning and the end of the first half form a literary framework to help us get a perspective on what is going on in that first half of the book. So what do those vessels stand for? What do they say to us? Well, they were taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And they were placed, we are told, in the temple of Nebuchadnezzar's God. But not just that. More precisely, Daniel records that they were placed in the treasure house of his God. It was a museum, of course. Like many museums today, Nebuchadnezzar had built it to put the best artifacts that he had plundered from the lands he had conquered. And even in the British Museum, I believe, there are some questions as to what belongs to whom. Were some of these artifacts plundered? Museums can do that, you know. But the whole point is that this was a treasure house. It contained things of value. Now, this is the focus, because those vessels in the temple were made of the most valuable elements they knew, silver and gold, and they symbolized what was valuable in that temple. They were crafted very carefully to be used to serve God, who is regarded as the supreme value. Indeed, the source of true value is God himself, the absolute creator God. And so we come to this crucial matter. The most important issue in our world, or one of them, is the question of values as it was then. It raises many questions, and one of the key ones is, are there such things as absolute values? Many people today say an emphatic no, that values are all relative. They are simply a product of society, and different societies have different value systems. And we've no right to judge anybody, and nobody else has the right to judge us. Now, just think of this, because what happens here is analysing precisely that shift from the absolute to the relative. Let me put it this way. What did Nebuchadnezzar do? He took those vessels, which to Daniel and his friends symbolized the absolute value of God, and he put them into the treasure house of his God, along with the other things he had taken from other nations. And you can imagine a whole series of rooms or display cabinets. One would be Judah, but that was only one among hundreds of other nations. So what did that represent? Nebuchadnezzar regarded them as valuable. He regarded them as beautiful, but they were only of relative value. They sat alongside artifacts from all the other countries. They certainly did not stand for anything of absolute value. So what Nebuchadnezzar is actually doing, if we stand back from it, is that he is relativizing the absolute. He's taking something of absolute value and making it of relative value. Now, we can see that happening in the world today. It is such a subtle thing. The absolute value of God has been replaced by many things of relative value. And we often list three of them: money, sex, and power, that dictate the values of so many different people. And we notice that what happens is that if we relativize the absolute, it can lead not only to the dilution of moral values, but to their eventual destruction. Take, for example, human life. The fundamental biblical teaching is that human beings are made in the image of God, their creator. Now, that gives every human being, whatever their worldview, all of us, an infinite value. If you watch Jordan Peterson, you'll see in his discussion of that statement, which he comes across in Genesis chapter 1, he reads it and he says, this idea that human beings are made in the image of God, that's the cornerstone of civilization, and we neglect it to our peril. Indeed we do. Because once you lose the linkage between human beings as infinitely valuable, made in the image of God, you start to subtly reduce their value, and it can become zero. Think of Peter Singer, arguably the world's leading ethicist, who states that a newborn baby, especially a disabled one, is of less value than a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. You see, if there is no God, then human beings are of course not made in his image because he doesn't exist. They have no absolute value. They've only got relative value. So if you want to mix human DNA with animal DNA and make a chimera, why shouldn't you? As someone, a leading geneticist, once said to me, look, this cell, this fertilized cell, is just a collection of molecules and atoms. Why shouldn't we do what we want to do with it? And I simply pointed out, yes, on your worldview, that's what it is. But if my worldview is true, the Christian worldview, that is something that has all the potential of becoming an adult human being made in the image of God. What right have you to mess with it? So what we believe about our values determines what we believe about human beings. And that's why it is absolutely crucial for us to ask, what are our values? And one of the very interesting things is, doesn't the biblical value system resonate with what many of us, whether we are Christians or not, really believe, that there's something very special about human beings, even though a lot of philosophers and thinkers are pushing against that worldview. We have huge possibility in science and medicine to do certain things, but the basic ethical question often remains unanswered. We can do this, but should we do it? Can we argue that, for example, human physical life is of such relative value that we can experiment with it to our heart's content in the hope that we will cure some awful diseases? I mean, we'd love to see cures for some of the diseases that affect our world, but we need to ask the question, should it be done at any price? Is it, for example, right to create so-called savior siblings that are created in the laboratory simply to provide spare organs for the disease? Is the right to a child an absolute value so that it is in order to use donor eggs or sperm? And above all, have the unborn really no value? You would think that was true when we look at the millions that are aborted every year. Now, we see from this that the book of Daniel is relevant, more relevant than perhaps some of us imagine, because what it's going to do is to challenge all of this. It's going to come in and raise the big questions about value, not only about medicine and ethics, but in every area. The danger of relativizing the absolute is seen in other areas as well, particularly religious worldviews. And often people will say to me as a Christian, you believe in Jesus? Well, that's wonderful, but it doesn't work for me. If it works for you, fine. I find that crystals work marvelously for me. So don't you come telling me that Jesus is unique. There are many ways to God if there is a God. None of them is of absolute value. They're all of only relative value, so all we need to do is pick and choose what suits us best. Look, we have created a global village with the internet and our communications. We just can't afford any more of narrow-minded exclusivism that claims things like Jesus is the only way to God. This is dangerous stuff. It's fundamentalism. And we all know where fundamentalism leads. It leads to things like 9/11. So perhaps it would be far better to have no religion at all. Or, failing that, let's at least keep it to ourselves and keep it out of the public space. Let's relativize it, because that's the best we can say about it. Well, it's not actually. I don't think this is a matter of relatives at all. I certainly believe that many things in the world are of relative importance. But when it comes to the claim that Jesus is the Son of God, that is an absolute, because his claim is either true or false. Either he is the Son of God or he is not. And because I'm convinced of the truth of that, it's pretty clear I'm going to get a lot of opposition when I try to stand for it in public. But I do so, as Daniel did so, because I believe it's of central importance. I can imagine Daniel and his friends, strangers in Babylon, sitting by the river and remembering where they'd come from. I could imagine Daniel saying, guys, let's go down to the museum. And then going in and standing in front of the cabinet with those golden vessels and saying to one another, that's it. Nebuchadnezzar may have tried to relativize our values, but we're not going to do that. I can imagine them actually bowing their heads and resolving that this would be the place where they draw the line. It's got a Christian equivalent. In the famous Lord's Prayer, it says, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. And that word hallowed, it's an Old English word, but what it means is setting God as our supreme value. That is what Daniel and his friends would have been doing. And that absolute estimate of the value of God was what held them standing very clear for God in a society that attempted to relativize so many things. So let's sum up so far. Chapter 1 starts by focusing our attention on history. It then focuses our attention on values, and we actually find this topic of values running through the whole book. For example, in the second chapter of the book, Nebuchadnezzar has a vision of a colossal image of a giant, a man, and his appearance is very strange because running from his head to his feet, there are various sections made of metals of a different value, and that is stressed. So it is an image, a vision about values. And possibly because he was told that he was the head of gold in this image, he next, in chapter 3 of Daniel, makes a vast golden image itself. And that, of course, is about values too. It's what Nebuchadnezzar thought of the state, and he absolutized it. And then we notice something very interesting in that. You see, it doesn't stop with relativizing the absolute. When people take something of absolute value and make it of relative value, very soon they will be taking something of relative value and making it absolute. Whether it's power, money, and in Nebuchadnezzar's case, it was the state and himself. And in his huge pride, he says, isn't this great Babylon that I built for my power and by the might of my glory? That's about values too. And then again, as we pointed out a bit earlier, we end up at Belshazzar's feast, and Belshazzar takes those golden vessels symbolizing the absolute value of God. He puts them on his table, allows his nobles to drink about them, and what he's really doing is saying, God, that's how I value you. And a hand wrote on the wall, the very famous writing on the wall, and it essentially said to Belshazzar in the following words, you are weighed in the balances and found wanting. That is a very serious message. If you value God at zero, you are risking God valuing you at zero. And that's exactly what happened to Belshazzar. That night, he lay on the floor, a dead corpse, as the Medo-Persian Empire walked in and took over Babylon as their capital.